In 1995, a team of researchers led by Doctors Christian de Muizan and H. Gregory MacDonald published a paper describing a new species of ground sloth that lived in western Peru. The team gave this new species the name of Thalassocnus, and several more specimens and species would be uncovered throughout the next decade. At first glance, Thalassocnus doesn't seem to be all that remarkable for a ground sloth. While they are extinct today, ground sloths were widespread and very common throughout the Americas during the Cenozoic, with some species like Megatherium getting rather large, about the size of small elephants today. They lived in a variety of different environments, mostly in forest and grasslands, but some species lived in seasonal wetlands, and one, known as Megalonyx, appears to have lived up in the mountains of Colorado, and that's what makes Thalassocnus really interesting. Instead of being uncovered in forest and grassland environments like just about every other ground sloth we know of, Thalassocnus is only found along the coast in marine deposits. Instead of chowing down on leaves and fruits like its many cousins, this genus of sloth appears to have abandoned the forest for the seas. Sloths were once an incredibly diverse group of mammals. Today, there are only 6 species of tree sloths that still exist, but there used to be dozens of species throughout the Pliocene epoch, found all across the Americas for about 35 million years. Many of these ground sloths filled similar ecological niches to elephants and rhinos, but they all went extinct during the Pleistocene extinction event about 10,000 years ago. And again, they were incredibly successful, feeding on the trees and grasses of the American environments of the time, but Thalassocnus was a pioneer of its trade. Fossils of this genus date back to between 7 and 3 million years ago, and all of them have been found along the western coast of South America in Peru and Chile, which at the time, and relatively still is, an arid desert. So how could a large herbivorous sloth survive in a desert environment? Well, as I mentioned a second ago, Thalassocnus is only ever found in sediments associated with marine environments, with multiple sites showing this genus thriving in an environment where other land-based mammals couldn't. But these sloths weren't just scraping a living along the Pacific coastline of South America. The morphology of the skeletons are actually surprisingly similar to other aquatic-based mammals like beavers and otters, indicating that the sloths were actively living in and under the water. But outside of being an aquatic or at least a semi-aquatic sloth, Thalassocnus really isn't all that different than other ground sloths of the time. As far as ground sloths go, Thalassocnus was by no means the largest. It was actually rather small, with the early members of the genus only measuring about 8.5 feet in length, but they continued to get larger over time, with the final species, Thalassocnus yacuensis, measuring about 11 feet in length. And because Thalassocnus is the only known xenarthran, the group of animals that includes sloths, anteaters, and armadillos, to evolve into an aquatic lifestyle, the 5 species of the genus that we have are considered to be a single evolutionary lineage known as a chronospecies. The evolutionary progression of the genus shows how the sloths continued to adapt more into their marine lifestyle, with the later species probably spending the vast majority of their time underwater. But what was it that allowed these sloths to even begin this evolutionary journey in the first place? Well, to start off, sloths as a group tend to have denser bones than other mammals, which would have given Thalassocnus an easy adaptation to take advantage of in the transition. This is actually seen in a lot of tetrapods that evolve from a land-based lifestyle to an aquatic one. Denser bones allow aquatic animals to stay submerged and not waste energy when diving, although free-floating mammals like whales actually have an overall lighter skeleton to help offset their massive size, which gives them more of a neutral buoyancy. But with Thalassocnus, a denser skeleton would have allowed them to sink easily and quickly to the seafloor to graze on sea grasses and seaweeds, similar to modern-day dugongs and manatees. But unlike sirenians, Thalassocnus probably didn't spend a whole lot of time actively swimming. The earlier species were still in their transitional phase, probably feeding along the shoreline or in shallow water, as indicated by the scratch marks on their teeth from chewing sand. And since they were still relatively land-based, their bone density was similar to other ground sloths, as well as the way that they carried their weight on the sides of their feet. But the later species were much more adapted to actively swimming and diving, with their bones being so dense that they almost didn't have any marrow in their limbs. They planted their feet flat to aid in paddling and walking along the seafloor, and their nostrils moved from the front of the snout to the top, a convergent adaptation that they share with seals. And unlike the earlier species, the later ones don't have scratch marks on their teeth, indicating that they were probably feeding on grasses and seaweeds in deeper water, just like dugongs and manatees do. Modern tree sloths are relatively decent swimmers, and the later species probably moved in a similar manner, using their limbs to paddle and drag themselves along the seafloor, possibly even using them as anchors and shovels to dig up the seagrasses that they fed on. Subsequent studies of skulls of later species at least hint at the possibility that they possessed a short trunk similar to elephant seals, although it's unknown if they actually had this, and if they did, if this was found in both males and females, or like elephant seals, only the males possessed them. Their spines were adapted to a predominantly aquatic lifestyle as well. The muscles that control the neck were overall weaker, as they didn't have to hold their heads up as much, but the joint that controls neck movement was stronger than other sloth species, likely an adaptation to help hold the head still and downward as they fed. And similar to whales, the later Thalassocnus species were able to align their head directly with their spine as they swam. The later Thalassocnus species fed entirely along the seafloor, becoming specialist bottom feeders of seagrasses. Because of their limb structure, while they were able to swim, they were not strong swimmers, and they primarily walked along the seafloor. And while Thalassocnus were pioneers of the trade for sloths, they were not the first and only marine mammals to evolve to an aquatic lifestyle in their environment. Since Thalassocnus really only fed on seagrasses, it almost certainly competed with dugongine sirenians of the time, although the fossil record indicates that dugongs weren't really common in the environment that Thalassocnus has been found in. And there was also a very strange species of toothed whale called Odobonocetos, which was a small species that had a 6-foot tusk growing out of its right jawline backwards towards the tail. Odobonocetos was a suction feeder, filling a niche similar to walruses, feeding on mollusks, crustaceans, and fishes. So it and Thalassocnus didn't compete with each other for food, but they almost certainly frequently encountered each other. But there were more predatory whales in these waters than Odobonocetos, including several macroraptorial sperm whales like the giant leviathan and the smaller Acrophyseter, the latter of which probably fed occasionally on Thalassocnus. Injured sloths would have also been vulnerable to shark attacks, including from early great whites and possibly small juvenile megalodon. Thalassocnus existed for approximately 4 million years along the coastline of Peru and Chile, thriving in the warm waters that were loaded with seagrass. But it was an overall cooling trend of the climate at the end of the Pliocene that spelled the inevitable extinction. It was right around this time that the Central American Seaway was finally closed off as South America continued to drift northwards, cutting off a key warm ocean current from the Atlantic and killing off the majority of the seagrasses that Thalassocnus thrived on. And on top of a decrease in food sources, Thalassocnus simply wasn't that well adapted to survive the changing environment. Because Thalassocnus evolved to have even denser bones than most other ground sloths, it was what we refer to as negatively buoyant. Thalassocnus was extremely well adapted to grab a breath of air and then sink to the bottom of the seabed without spending a lot of energy, but this comes at an evolutionary cost. Most marine mammals, with the exception of sea otters, rely on an insulatory layer of blubber to stay warm, and blubber is very buoyant. A good ratio of blubber and denser bones gives animals like whales, seals, and sea lions an overall neutral buoyancy, so they don't have to spend a lot of energy diving, surfacing, and they can put most of their energy into just being really efficient swimmers. Alongside being a good buoyancy method, blubber is really good at insulating you from the cold. But since Thalassocnus needed to be able to sink to the seabed, it didn't have this insulatory buoyant blubber layer. And you can probably see where this is going. Because it didn't have a blubber layer, it likely wasn't going to do well in a cooling ocean environment. And to top it all off, Thalassocnus, being a sloth, it probably didn't have a very high metabolic rate, so it just wasn't well adapted to the changing environment that it was facing, even if enough seagrass had remained. And then, about 3 million years ago, the world's only aquatic sloth finally went extinct. What makes Thalassocnus unique is not just the fact that it's an aquatic sloth. The fact that it is an aquatic sloth means that it left behind a very detailed fossil record. So detailed that we can see through its time how it evolved from a land-based animal to an aquatic-based animal. It's just one of the few cases in the fossil record where we can watch a species continue to adapt more and more to its chosen environment. In the end, Thalassocnus was an evolutionary explorer, joining whales and sirenians in abandoning the land for the sea. But it just goes to show that even the most daring of adventurers can't always beat the unstoppable forces of an ever-changing world.